for a whole bunch of therapists and physicians and nurses, and even had a couple of pharmacists in the group. It was an absolutely wonderful experience. I feel like I think we learned maybe more than we taught, but it was kind of like a cultural exchange, and we had the opportunity to train would-be sex therapists and also learn a great deal of cultural differences, as it were. Karen is the author of her first book, was called Love and Sex, The Basics, Dr. Karen Carpenter. I have that here if we are watching on the video. And she has a brand new book that I'm really excited to hear more about if we can get her on the phone. Last time we spoke, we were talking about the research that she was doing, and that's not going to be visible at all. I'm sorry about that, but it's called Interweaving Tapestries of Culture and Sexuality in the Caribbean. Karen did a comparative study of sexual attitudes in different Caribbean nations, Jamaica and Barbados, and a few others. Hopefully she'll be along to talk about her research. We were really kind of stunned at how many ways, well, of course, like comparing any cultures, there's similarities and differences, but we certainly learned a great deal. Larry and I had been doing training over many years, different professions, and one company that we'd worked with had done continuing education training for massage therapists. And they would they coined the term cruise for CEUs, CEUs being continuing education credits that professionals need to maintain their license. And we'd just go on a 7-day cruise somewhere around the Caribbean and do our classes and have this wonderful thrill. And so it was kind of a cultural exchange. And when we went to Kingston, actually I met Dr. Karen in Florida. She's a fellow alum of the Florida Sex Therapy Training Institute that my dear late mentor, Dr. Susan Lee, ran. And it was, kind of a cultural eye-opener, as I said. We learned how, first I was, getting to the point that in the course of doing these cruises, sometimes we would go to Jamaica, and like a lot of Americans who visit Jamaica, you end up in all the typical touristy places like Montego Bay and Ocho Rios. Our first trip to Kingston was truly like the first time. It felt like it was the first time we were going to Jamaica. It was completely different than any of the usual places. And we learned a lot about the roles of women in particular, and the values, the way relationships are treated. I think that Americans still have a lot of misconceptions about Jamaica. I think particularly a lot of younger Americans or folks my age usually think that everybody's smoking pot and listening to reggae and practicing Rastafarianism. Of course, that's a segment of the culture of the society, but like every other place, there's all kinds of people. I should mention that Dr. Carpenter also has been doing radio down there in Jamaica for quite a long time. We've had the pleasure of guesting on her show. And through those contacts, I was also invited to talk on a noon hour show, which was like 180 degrees different. Karen's show is kind of hip and progressive and pretty open and talking about sex. This noontime show was a bunch of older conservative guys, and it was, it was a bit clipped. It was not quite so easy and free in talking about sex. And the attitudes, again, just like here, some folks are more conservative. Religiosity certainly plays a role, and more or less inhibited when it comes to these discussions. But I do have to say, I think the one image one story that stuck the most from our first trip to Kingston was hearing the story of the statues in Emancipation Park. And since I probably can't show you on my laptop here, you can use Google Images and check out Emancipation Park in Kingston. And it was just a rather extraordinary story of these sculptures that were commissioned. Tall sculptures, abstract art sculptures, but they're nudes, a male and female figure. Some of the folks in our trainings were telling us how there was this controversy around these giant nude sculptures right in the heart of Kingston in Emancipation Park. And at that time, it was still during the George W. Bush administration. It was right around the same time when we had our own little sexual scandal about nudity in public, when some of you may remember when there was a big furor over the naked breast on the statue of blind justice in I believe it was the State Supreme Courthouse of Georgia. And then Attorney General John Ashcroft was apparently so offended that he insisted that, if I remember, something on the order of $6,000 of taxpayer money was spent to robe the naked breast, lest we be shocked and offended. So, when I heard that they had commissioned an artist to produce these huge, beautiful sculptures of the nude male and female figure, I figured, with my American bias, sure, of course, I get why there'd be outrage. Why it would be a scandal and people would be, making a stink. Much to my surprise, though, as it turned out, the furor wasn't over the nudity of the sculpture. The furor was over the size of the genitalia, particularly on the male figure, that folks felt it was not big enough to represent the proud Jamaican man. And they actually, as the story was told, commissioned the artist to come back and make it bigger. And I thought, well, that's not something we would likely see in the United States. So in some ways, again, we have similarities in kind of a male-dominated culture. Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of sex-positive education and information. And unfortunately, there tends to be a good deal of homophobia, both rather fierce intolerance of homosexual men, and even in some circles, an almost tolerated violence towards gay women, just based on some of these attitudes. And of course, in some parts of the culture, maybe among some Rastas, it's long known that there's this idea of men being able to, or tolerating other partners, possibly even other families with other women. Of course, the most famous native son was Bob Marley, and I remember reading a story years ago that his widow, Rita Marley, officially recognized, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 42 some odd siblings in terms of his estate, officially recognized. And there is that gender double standard where it would not be tolerated for a woman to have multiple partners. So while that sexism still exists, I couldn't help but notice that Jamaican women seemed an awful lot more, oddly enough, more empowered and independent and able to stand up and even demanding sexual pleasure, which is something that very often we struggle with in the United States. We still tend toward a more puritanical and inhibited sense for a lot of people. So culture, we've talked about this. I talked about this with Larry last week, that culture and values around sexuality influence even the most basic of education. We talked about how sexual health information is kind of hobbled when we're just so embarrassed and uncomfortable, even to just have the conversation. In the course of my now coming up on 25 years of doing sexuality education, I've observed what to me is just so extraordinarily upside down and wrong. And I can't help but think such a sign of poor sexual health that it seems to be easier for a lot of people to have sex, to actually have intercourse, especially, in the dark with a good buzz on, than to talk about having sex. And it seems like if we were sexually healthier, it would be the other way around, right? A conversation should not be considered more intimate and more scary than actually, tossing back a few, turning off the lights, and rolling around naked. Even, this kind of old school stereotype of the nervous bride, and the honeymoon, and this big buildup of, oh my God, the event is going to happen, and, coming out of the bathroom after 45 minutes fully clothed, underwear and pajamas and a robe, and walking around the room and turning off all the lights and kind of groping in the dark and sliding, pulling off the robe and sliding under the covers and shimmying out of her pajamas under the covers and pulling the blankets up to her neck like this and saying, okay, I'm ready. Clearly that doesn't sound like doesn't look like the posture of someone who's ready to engage in what should be fun and exciting and sexy and pleasurable, mutual sex play, right? I've often said it's only sex work if you're getting paid for it. Otherwise, it's supposed to be play. Yet so many people have these kinds of worries and anxieties that people can actually have sex and not have a whole lot of fun. I see Dr. Karen on the video. Karen, can you hear me? Are you on the line? Do we have sound? I sure hope so. Dr. Karen, are you there with us? Maybe she'll be joining us shortly. No, we don't have audio. Okay. Well, again, feel free to call me if there's anything you want to ask about, any topics you want to bring up at all, maybe related to culture and sex ed, or really anything that's on your mind. I'll give you the number again, 888-565-1470. Call in and tell me what's on your mind. If people were, in a perfect world, if people were sexually informed and comfortable and confident and, imagine that wedding night scenario where people were actually bringing in lamps from other rooms and brightening up the place and standing naked as a jaybird, standing on the bed facing each other. And I think that would probably be a more likely picture of someone who's ready and willing and, present. That idea of being present during sex is a big one in my work in sex therapy. There's a couple of terms that sex therapists love to use. One is spectatoring, where one is kind of like watching themselves rather than being involved. They're sort of leaving their body and kind of standing at the foot of the bed, very often with a critical eye. It could be, and this goes for men as well as women. It seems kind of universal. People are either critical of themselves, they're worrying about what they look like. I think that's part of the reason for the tendency to turn off all the lights. The other favorite phrase that sex therapists use, and really it's kind of the probably the most typical explanation for just about all sexual dysfunction, is the idea of performance anxiety. This is real typical with guys, oddly enough, because the reputation, let's face it, it's the gender stereotypes are that guys are just horny, pigs, dogs, pick your favorite barnyard animal, and always all the cliches we use, thinking with the wrong head, and driven by this constant lust and looking for an available partner. When the truth is, that I'm not denying that there's plenty of guys that are out there. There's guys that would go to a club and figure it's just a numbers game. If you hit on every woman in the club, eventually somebody's bound to go along. But I think part of what's really typical and what we don't acknowledge often enough is that for a lot of guys, along with that lust, along with that horniness, comes a great deal of anxiety. In other words, a sexual opportunity presents itself, and while there's the, oh, goody, this is about to happen, very often there's also that, uh-oh, we're on. Like every sexual experience is a test. Our manhood is on the line. Our masculinity is on the line. We've got to be big enough and hard enough and last long enough and not finish too quickly and not take too long. And what happens then, that's what leads to the spectatoring, right? Instead of sex being this immersive thing between people, they're kind of running up in their head and watching and observing and criticizing and worrying. And like an angry coach, don't mess up, don't drop the ball, don't blow it. And that ends up being work, and that creates anxiety, and anxiety creates dysfunction, right? It's kind of, it's really ironic. We have these self-fulfilling prophecies. The best way for a guy to almost guarantee losing an erection is to go into a situation worrying about losing his erection, right? If a woman is worrying whether or not she's going to be able to make herself have an orgasm, chances are she won't, right? It's the immersion. It's getting out of the head and being present with that person and able to, I always like the old iced tea commercials where they talk about taking the plunge. Just fall back and have that trust. Okay. So I guess I could bring that around to sex therapy, where sex therapists find that it's addressing that anxiety and helping couples to, sometimes it's so simple. Just, we remind couples that they're lovers or they were if, life has gotten in the way and, we, the stressors of life, whether it's kids or money or in-laws or jobs, all the usual stressors, it's hard to leave them out of the bedroom sometimes, and it's hard to remember that even in life stressors are unavoidable, but rather than kind of taking it out on the person right there, your partner, your mate, your chosen one, folks tend to turn it on each other, and then that stress, there's conflict, and the sexiness goes away. And folks complain that they're too tired, or they're, they've lost that spark. To me, that's always a sign, right? So imagine somebody says they're too tired to have sex with their beloved, right? Think back when we were younger. Was there ever such a thing as too tired for sex? Right? Somebody would work a double shift at work and go running home on foot to get home for the opportunity to have sex. So to me, it's very diagnostic when I hear that, oh, we were too tired. That means there's something else going on. Very often that's avoidance. The erotic connection between lovers is not something that is naturally sustainable passively, right? I think there's a reason why we have these such common cliches, stereotype pattern in relationships that it's hot and heavy and sexy at the beginning and just sort of fades. I would reference the brilliant therapist and author Barry McCarthy, who has written a great deal about the low sex or the no sex marriage, which it seems to be this kind of uniquely American problem, and almost like our dirty little secret that nobody really talks about, the fact that a lot of married couples just aren't even having sex at all anymore. And not just couples who've been married for 25 or 30 years, but I hear this a lot from, younger millennials, and even like, your typical kind of urban hipster power couple, where from the outside everybody thinks they're just great. They're a team, they're raising the kids, they're cooking together, and just really look like a great united couple, a strong relationship. Then you come to find out that they're not having sex either. So what is it that makes this natural entropy towards just a waning of the sex drive? It's kind of frustrating there, isn't it? So sex therapists help couples keep it sexy, and sometimes it's as simple as remembering, right? Invariably, not always, of course, but most of the time, when a couple comes to my sex therapy practice with particular sexual dysfunction or a problem, or the simple fact that they just have lost their desire, or whatever the struggle. My first job is to get a sense, a diagnostic picture. Sometimes you have to do a little detective work to figure out what this current problem is. But then after I do that, I will typically say, well, tell me, what was it like at the beginning when you two first got together? And almost all the time, like I said, not all couples, but almost all the time, couples respond in the same way. They say things like, well, come on, it was hot. We had sex all the time. We couldn't keep our hands off each other. We had sex several times a day in every room of the house. And then, why, after a dozen or 18 years of marriage, are you here in my office telling me that you haven't had sex in 9 years? That's kind of what we have to dissect, do a little forensic work and find out, follow that timeline. And like I said before, usually it's the usual suspect culprits, the stressors of life that make their way in the bedroom. Sex therapy is usually done with behavioral assignments that the couple is sent home with. I know there's a lot of silly misperceptions that people have. They think that, we have big beds in our office and, like a laboratory, we're going to watch them have sex, or we're going to follow them home, and stand at the foot of their bed. Going to just pause here and do another station promo. We're at wwnnradio.com, 1470 AM, 93.5 FM. And by all means, call in with any questions or comments at 888-565-1470. You can reach me at 561-809-1080, or go to the Facebook page for Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel, and you can email through the Facebook page. We're going to have to wrap it up, I think, for this evening. My apologies. I will do my best to get Dr. Carpenter back with us next week, because there's a lot of exciting research that I know you'd love to hear about. So thanks for tuning in. Apologies once again for the technical glitches, and please join us again next Monday at 9 p.m.
You've been listening to Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel. Join us every Monday night at 9 on WNN, 1470 AM and 95.3 FM. Or watch live streaming video at AMP2 TV Productions on Facebook, or look for the shows on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us again next week. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of the station, its staff, management, or sponsors.